Is the lab leak hypothesis that I discussed here on Monday just another conspiracy theory? What's really the difference between what I talked about with the scientific journals and the scientists around Anthony Fauci and the State Department and the wacky stories around the Great Reset or the climate conspiracy? Well, let's discuss. I've been having an email exchange with a friend who accused me of having fallen for exactly the sort of conspiracy theories that I tend to debunk on this channel. He's convinced that the peer-reviewed science counts out any sort of gain-of-function manipulation having been involved in SARS-CoV-2. And in looking at the sort of case that I was making in my last video, he classified it like this. Of course, anyone can invent conspiracy theory whereby the virus doesn't really look like that, the study was faked, it was ordered because of pressure from China to shut down claims it was man-made, all of the 3,000 plus researchers who cited it have been paid off to fake their own studies, and anyone who tried to publish studies contradicting it were rejected by a cabal of journal editors who are also in on the conspiracy. This is a template for all conspiracy theories. Yes, indeed. But is that really the story that you need to believe in order to accept the possibility, not the certainty, just a possibility, that there's a lab leak of a virus that had had gain-of-function research applied to it? And is that really the story that I was telling on this channel on Monday and before? Some time ago I did a video on conspiracy theories and I talked about the difference between a conspiracy theory and a real life conspiracy. The former tends to be a wide body of often vaguely related people at best, with unfeasibly large and counterintuitive objectives and supposed perfection in execution over an extended time frame. Real-life conspiracies have almost always been small numbers of people with a clear and intuitively obvious short-term interest. They often come in the form of government departments, especially ones like security services that have the inbuilt structure of covertly exercising power with tenuous oversight. And they're often about covering up something that went wrong. Now, obviously, the version described by my friend would fit into the first category with its wide-ranging universe of thousands of researchers and a cabal of journal editors and so on. Now, I've said nothing about thousands of researchers nor any cabals, but is that the hidden implication of what I have said? Does any of it hang together in the absence of such a collective? First of all, my friend and I both agree that a lab leak is possible. He thinks it can only have been a natural virus, not a manipulated one. I think all options remain open. So the possibility of an accident is not the point of disagreement. In principle, I also don't understand why anyone should find it controversial that this would involve a virus that had been worked upon with gain-of-function research. We know, because it is documented in the peer-reviewed literature, that such research is carried out, and indeed is carried out by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I described in my last video how, for instance, mice have been given human cell characteristics via genetic modification as detailed in this paper by US researcher Ralph Barrick, a collaborator with the Wuhan Institute. And I shared the grant title the Institute received in 2018, which showed entirely openly and transparently that it was working with those techniques on bat coronaviruses. So gain-of-function work exists, is carried out by the Wuhan Institute. Nobody that I'm aware of has disputed that. There is, similarly, discussion in the journals from long ago that such research is controversial, because by its nature it brings with it the danger that you create that which you fear. So, for example, here's just one article published in Nature discussing the concerns that people have. It's not as though we're positing something outlandish. It was intuitively obvious that this is a heightened risk, hence why the US government imposed a moratorium on it a few years ago. So, given that all that is the case, the thing that puzzles me is why researchers were so quick, so unequivocal to rule it out as a possibility. Having looked at quite a lot of research papers by now since I started doing this channel, scientists tend to be very precise about their language and very slow to be definitive on questions where some uncertainty exists. They will say that something is highly likely, but very rarely will they say that something is certain. If it's just about the science, that is. And the problem is, this isn't just all about the science. Since the pandemic kicked off, a lot of this has been about geopolitics, and that does influence the stakes. plus the historically unusual confounding aspect of the Orange Man. A big part of the reason why people ruled it out was because Trump ruled it in. And his comments, whether he intended them this way or not, was seen by some as an attack on China that people decided was xenophobic and therefore something that they didn't want to associate with. That had little to do with the science, but it was unavoidably part of the context. Now, this comes down to a comment I made about the difficulty that one or two researchers who'd put forward a paper suggesting the possibility of lab manipulation had in getting published. And my friend said this: there are only two reasons why papers fail to get published in reputable journals. One is that they are not important or significant enough for the journal in question, and the other is that they fail peer review because their methodology, calculations or inference are heavily flawed. And I agree that 99% of the time that is the norm, at least outside the social sciences where there's an argument about ideology capture, a discussion for another time. The majority of people who think they're Einstein, challenging the orthodoxy with their genius, or the whistleblower, exposing the cosy cabal of lies, the vast majority of those people are engaged in complete self-deception. Doesn't mean it can't happen, which is why you evaluate people's arguments on their substance. But I hold that nevertheless, my friend forgot the words "in an ideal world," because processes run by human beings are always more complex. This is why, of course, in the course of the scientific process, researchers are supposed to declare if they have any interests. And for example, the Peter Daszak letter in The Lancet, one of the two influential pieces that effectively shut the discussion down in the early days, declared that no such interest existed in that case, and we can surely agree that that was not true. I haven't seen anyone publicly suggest that Daszak did not have a conflict of interest. He ran some of the gain-of-function research with the Wuhan Institute, putting him at the centre of the controversy. Surely you would think Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, would know that. So on that alone, it's hard to argue that it didn't fall short of the process that we feel it should be. But that's not the only relevant factor. The big actor in this geopolitical context is obvious. The government of China has demonstrated behaviour numerous times in recent years of financially supporting Western institutions such as universities, sports teams and publishers, and then using the financial leverage to demand public support and compliance, such as the Houston Rockets, who were punitively punished by China after General Manager Daryl Morey tweeted his support for Hong Kong protesters. And while that controversy was raging, Nike quietly pulled all of the Houston Rockets merchandise from the Chinese stores. And LeBron James attacked Morey, saying he wasn't educated on the situation. Just one example of numerous ones of the last decade where we've seen companies, sports teams and other institutions, as well as celebrities, who have disgraced themselves in the energy with which they fell into line. China is an authoritarian government, I hate to break it to you. Remember, the doctor who first raised the alarm about COVID was punished for doing so. They play by different rules. And this is what we've seen over and over again playing out in public. So that much cannot be conspiracy theory, right? We agree that China aggressively defends its interests wherever it has leverage over people. And this hasn't just played out in high-profile sports arenas. China has been big in bolstering its profile in academia. The influence on universities has been a big focus of attention on this. This article, one of many, talking about how the universities have become increasingly keen to avoid offending China in recent years to protect their lucrative revenue streams. And this is a thing, because China has become particularly proactive and particularly prickly in taking offence. All of that is on the public record. Now let's talk about the journals, Nature and The Lancet. As I mentioned in Monday's video, the publisher of Nature, Springer Nature, has something like $10 million worth of deals with China. 4 years ago, the Financial Times exposed that they had been censoring hundreds of articles for Chinese viewers based on the Chinese government's preferred censorship. Some additional details I picked up since then. A year later, that position hadn't changed. One set of book editors refused to work with them for that reason, saying that it constituted an unacceptable breach of trust. Another Springer Nature journal just last year demanded the removal of a reference to Taiwan in a paper, under threat of it being rejected if they didn't do it. They obviously hadn't heard about my friend's only 2 reasons for rejection argument. Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, has a similar arrangement. Again, as I mentioned previously, he was given a Friendship Award by China in 2015 in recognition of his work with them. And he defended China in The Guardian, and The Lancet published incisive papers such as China's successful control of COVID-19, asking, while the world is struggling to control COVID-19, China has managed to control the pandemic rapidly and effectively. How was that possible? And the answer was that they were jolly fine people, nothing to do with, authoritarianism or anything like that. Plus Horton's own work, COVID-19 and the dangers of xenophobia. One letter writer mentioned the Uyghurs and complained when footage emerged of blindfolded Uyghurs being carted off to concentration camps, not everyone would have felt comfortable with Richard Horton's characterization of the Chinese as friends. Now, we would hope that professional scientific journals would be able to ignore such financial interests and be motivated purely by the science. That they would, in so doing, prove themselves different to the sports teams and the universities and the Nikes and the Apples and the Disneys. However, I am open to the possibility that behaviour that suggests they might not have held that line might indeed be an indicator that they are, after all, only human. Once the virus emerged, we agree that China has done everything possible to bully anyone who might suggest that there had been a lab leak, yes? I mean, picking a fight with Australia simply for calling for an independent inquiry, and that wasn't a one-off. So, do we think that it doesn't play out when it comes to those 2 journals? That China would quietly have respected their integrity and avoided putting pressure on them, even though they were applying it to every single other institution and person? Another indicator, the scientists that went on the WHO mission to Wuhan were agreed as acceptable to China. I recall that the original proposed list was rejected by China, and they took a close interest in who should get to go. One of the ones approved was, as we know, Peter Daszak, who various of his peers commented should not have been on that project due to the obvious conflict of interest. But that wasn't held to be a disqualifying factor, just one more reason why that expedition attracted disquiet. Well, when Richard Horton set up a Lancet committee to look at the virus origins, the chair turned out to be Peter Daszak. Now, that doesn't prove that Horton's committee was influenced by Horton's links with China, but it's certainly compatible with that view, and rather odd otherwise, again, given the obvious conflict of interest. That Daszak's committee was reportedly consulted over the paper submitted to the Lancet that was criticising Daszak's letter defending China. That is also odd. Some would say downright bizarre. My friend used the phrase a cabal of editors, but it should be obvious that's not what I'm describing here. No, not a cabal of editors, no more than a cabal of US sports team owners or a cabal of corporations were in on the conspiracy when they shut down criticism of China within their own ranks over the last few years. And what about my friend's reference to the 3,000 researchers who were all in on the conspiracy? He's referring to the fact that the paper, Anderson et al., there was the substantial research paper out of those 2 early ones. Daszak's letter was just a political statement. The paper by Christian Anderson was the research core. That paper has received 3,000 citations. You'll remember Christian Anderson was the researcher who emailed Dr. Fauci saying that the virus looked like it might have been manipulated on the same day that he tweeted the opposite in reaction to one by Senator Tom Cotton. And when this all came out because of the release of the Fauci emails, his response was first to delete his old tweet and then to lie about it having been automated and then finally to delete his Twitter account entirely. Now, maybe he was actually telling the truth. He wouldn't have been the first person to decide to shut down a Twitter account when they were getting grief and mental distress from it. Or maybe it's another one of those features of real life conspiracies. People that are actually not used to lying turn out not to be very good at it, and they get found out. Unlike the omnipotent Illuminati types whose lies are so subtle you wouldn't even notice them unless, you were obsessively looking for them. So yes, his paper got 3,000 citations. The whole point of it is that it was very influential. But I've never suggested that this paper was so far off the mark that it was just fake. And all the researchers who looked at it secretly knew it was fake, but cited it anyway because they're all in on the plan. If you have to add details like that in order to dismiss someone's argument, you have to ask what you're actually doing. I mean, it sounds like a straw man. The vast majority of the paper is a careful description of the features of the genome of SARS-CoV-2. It does add an unequivocal statement as to its implications in the introduction and a slightly less unequivocal one in the main body of the paper. I'm generally assuming that researchers that cite other works don't routinely carry out detailed assessments of them before citing them. Otherwise, papers with many references would never get finished because they'd be doing all the backtracking research. Some of the psychology papers that turned out to be the core of the replicability crisis in that field were highly cited papers. So no, the fact that it was a highly influential paper and it was cited by thousands of people, that's why it's important. But the fact that 3,000 people cited it does not imply they were in on the scheme. I've never suggested that the journal Nature was so compromised by China that they would go along with publishing junk paper just because it fit the narrative. They might well blur a line. I mentioned in the last video about the 4 papers that emerged from the Chinese Institute in the weeks immediately following the outbreak that focused on the pangolin connection. And this was quickly detected to have been 4 papers all based on the same pangolins, and that the data was not correct in 2. Now, 2 of those papers were published by Nature. The one pointing out the problem was rejected by Nature. And the final footnote on that, I mentioned the letter from the researcher who'd worked with the Wuhan Institute, Ralph Barrick, where he and a number responded to the WHO expedition report by calling for all options to the virus origin to remain on the table. That letter was published by the journal Science, and that provoked an angry response from some researchers, which was then published in Nature. Now, not that Nature was influenced by China in publishing a response, of course, although it is a remarkable coincidence that the China-controlled Global Times reported that the rebuttal was in progress before it was published. Well, a lucky scoop on their part, I expect. As for the response itself, there is not a single science-based argument in it, it's all political. Even if the letter in Science was well-intentioned, its author should have thought through about how it would feed into the divisive political environment surrounding this issue, said one of the authors, Angela Rasmussen. Does that mean, as one commenter put it on Monday's video, that if this is true, then it means we can no longer trust a prestigious scientific journal like Nature and The Lancet to have produced anything that is scientifically valid? No, that is a massive overstatement. Nobody's suggesting that. Even the people calling for Richard Horton to resign as editor of The Lancet are not suggesting that. One of the things I did talk about that set off some red flags was the suggestion that the alternative view did not get easy publication. One of the people who struggled to get a paper with a different view published was Nikolai Petrovsky. Now, I am very aware of a phenomenon where random people, invariably described by the conspiracy true believers as the most prestigious in their field, think that they should get their bizarre rants published and fail deservedly. And the fact they fail is then put forward as evidence that the establishment are trying to silence them. I get the resemblance, but this is why I always say you should evaluate the facts anyway, rather than just dismiss things based on the crudest pattern recognition. Sometimes those people actually have a point. Maybe that's what happened here, the conspiracy line, but I don't believe that it is. Nikolai Petrovsky, an immunologist, professor of medicine at Flinders University, is well published with 25,000 citations from work related to this field. There is a phenomenon of highly respected researchers, often physicists, it's been noted, doing great work in their own field, then marching into someone else's and assuming they understand everything and making pronouncements from a position of relative ignorance. But no, this is his field, well published, and his paper on this struggled to get published, although it is now being so. So the quick dismissal my friend made when I mentioned it, implying not one serious science journal obviously thinks it's worthy of publication, is not the end word. Neither that paper nor any other that I've referred to suggests that it proves that the virus was carrying a fingerprint of manipulation. Petrovsky's paper simply highlighted that SARS-CoV-2 was surprisingly well adapted to human ACE2, more so than to any likely potential host animal or indeed even to bats, and therefore commented, after a lot of analysis that's well worth reading, one question to be addressed is whether the virus is completely natural and was transmitted to humans by an intermediate animal vector, or whether it came from a recombination event that occurred inadvertently or intentionally in a laboratory handling coronaviruses. Clearly, that does not propose itself to be proof that the virus has been manipulated. But as someone who is not an expert in this field, it does seem to me to be proof that people who are experts can look at the detail of the genome of SARS-CoV-2 and believe that what they see does not rule that possibility out, and indeed is rather suggestive of it. And for me, that is the only question hanging unanswered that makes me think that gain of function does remain a possibility. Why was this virus so highly adapted to the human environment from the beginning seems to be a relevant and central question. The conspiracy theorists tend to thrive on weirdly tangential questions, which they then imbue with meaning, like, why was molten steel dripping from the burning towers? Well, the fact the virus is well adapted to humans, not so well to bats, it's not the same sort of question, is it? So look, the big thing my friend pushed me on was motives. Crazy conspiracy theories generally depend on the most illogical, far-reaching motives for them to even make sense in the wonderland universe of those who believe in them. So let's be clear about one motivation I'm suggesting is definite and ones I'm suggesting are possible. Definite. After the virus emerged, China put a great deal of effort into shutting down any discussion it came from their lab, openly bullying anyone who suggested otherwise. Their motive for doing so, pretty obvious. The fact of their actions are all in the public record. Well, mostly in the public record. Motivations I'm suggesting are possible, and it would be important to know the truth. 1. Two journals, Nature and The Lancet, were under pressure from China because their lucrative dealings with it would be at risk if they gave gratuitous credence to anything throwing potential blame their way. It would be remarkable if they hadn't been under pressure, since it is a pattern that we have seen repeatedly. The only speculation is whether they were influenced by it in what they chose to publish or not, and to what degree they were. That's an interesting question for the integrity of science. But here's the thing, the possibility of a lab leak having taken place doesn't hinge on it. The second possible motive is for a relatively small group involved in the US government, I talked about this on Monday, who were reportedly, and reported by journalists who had seen meeting records, not conspiracists on Twitter. They were alarmed that their funding of gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute might end up being implicated, and they might end up themselves taking some of the blame for the pandemic. And that might well be motive enough for a paper to be produced very quickly to count out the possibility in more certain terms than I'm used to seeing. Again, does the theory depend on this having happened? No, they could have been well motivated but mistaken. Just as, of course, they could have been well motivated and correct. The Vanity Fair article certainly testified to records from internal State Department meetings that told of exactly the concern of blame coming their way. And it does seem to be a rational fear for them to have had. Under the circumstances, it's not as though no one's been running around pointing fingers of blame on this one. Clearly, from the email exchanges, nobody was in on the secret. If they feared that something might be true, it wasn't because they knew it to be true. Indeed, it wouldn't have been irrational for them to worry about getting the blame, even if it wasn't true. Politics being less meritocratic about blame than science is. Let me finish all of this by reminding you that none of this constitutes scientific proof that SARS-CoV-2 was manipulated before being leaked from the lab, if leaked it was. All it is pointing out that there is enough material here that it should not be discounted as a possibility. Maybe there is a body of published science out there that has proven this to be impossible. I'm always the first to agree that I am not qualified to judge. If I see credible scientists arguing the opposite, then in the short term I can only report the discussion and watch with interest and without presumption where it ends up. I think it comes down to those who argue that something has been definitively proven to put up a strong case to support that certainty. If they do, I will have no investment in any alternative version that would stop me from embracing it. Assuming, of course, that Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates tell me it's all right. What?